learning not to give up when times are tough and just keep going at it, keep pushing forward.
Telling someone's story through the form of video is the fundamentals of any cinematographer. Any successful narrative commercial feels naturalistic, but has a very specific look. There are so many different ways to execute this, but where do you even start? In this video, I'm going to show you how you can do that by going over a narrative commercial we recently shot. I'm going to be going over my lighting and composing techniques to show you exactly how we pulled this off. When shooting any narrative style commercial, you are usually working on someone's space and making their life look natural, but also elevated. This is achieved through the fundamentals of any cinematographer: composition and lighting. Framing a subject in a certain way allows your work to feel more intentional, as well as evokes emotion in a viewer, which can get the feeling across just with visuals. Lighting, on the other hand, elevates the world you are building and gives that commercial look we as cinematographers want to achieve. The commercial that we're going to be looking at was a content piece for a clothing brand for celebration of Lunar New Year. In this piece, we are in a pottery space with the owner telling her story of resilience. In this breakdown, I'm going to be going over a lot of things, but mainly composing, lighting, and show you exactly how we did this in terms of my thought process and the challenges that I had to overcome as a cinematographer. I was challenged by the directors in terms of making this feel as naturalistic as possible, but also giving my commercial flair in terms of composing, lighting, and then even some of the specialty shots that you see in this piece. The first thing that we're going to be starting off is the first shot of the piece, and then this is a dolly shot moving forward as the lights are being turned on. And this was a very interesting one because of the challenge that we wanted to have in terms of these initial shots of this opening shot. It is a dolly in. So the first thing I want to kind of just go over is the cameras that we use as well as the focal lengths. So this was shot on the Sony Venice because we wanted this to look early morning, that this is like an early morning rise, and this is what her routine looks like. So I set my camera's white balance to 4400 Kelvin. That pushes the outside lights, which was around, I guess, 7 o'clock that we shot this in the morning. And this pushes it to that blue look, as you can see in the skylight here, as well as the outside doors and everything like that. And then this gives us good contrast in terms of an orange and teal look, as you can see, in terms of the warm on the inside and the coolness on the outside. And then to actually achieve this shot, before we even go into lighting, this is a dolly shot, but the lens that we're using is a 12mm lens. And this basically sees everything in the room. As you can see that we have this big ceiling, this pipe, the walls, and everything. And the big challenge is when you are up on something so high and then you have a wide lens through a dolly, you get to see everything, and including the dolly track. So I knew that we needed some sort of riser, and this is exactly what we did. So if I have the camera and then this is my dolly track underneath, there has to be something in between. So this is my fluid head, and there has to be some sort of riser here that allows the dolly to happen. So this is my dolly, and then these are on stands as well, because the 12mm sees everything in terms of the focal plane and what we see in terms of the lens. When you're doing something like this, if I had my camera all the way down here, you would automatically see the dolly track. So we are only using like this second half of the dolly on a 4-foot pipe. So this is about 2 feet of travel, and we're just pushing past that in terms of we seeing the bottom of the stands and everything. So it was just an interesting but really simple problem in terms of raising the camera, but not necessarily raising the camera off the stands, but raising the camera off the dolly. So these are small things that I've purchased personally to basically help me in any of the situations instead of renting them, because I use them all the time. Now we can look into lighting. I'm just going to leave those diagrams there, but this is what we're starting with in terms of making this feel as natural and early morning as possible. So outside, there's actually a street lamp, and you can see that by some of the light coming in here. And I wanted to elevate that by utilizing these streaks of light that were coming through. So the natural light that was already there in terms of what it looks like daylight, but it was actually a street lamp, and I wanted to elevate that. So I had my gaffer just set up a tube, and it's literally standing out there like that, and it's providing some levels back into here that's painting all these little lines and everything to give us some detail back into the room. I wanted to motivate the light that was already coming from the skylight, and then this tube was adding that by giving it direction. The sun wasn't necessarily up at this point. Later on in the day, the sun comes up and you can see it blasting through the windows, but at this point it's not, and there was no detail in the room other than this skylight. So that tube was set at 5600 Kelvin, matching the daylight outside. side and then giving us this nice streaks of light that we see everywhere. Then as we move into the shot, we still have the same setup, but she turns on the light switch here and it turns on all the lights in the room. And luckily these lights were like not on like, I guess, a perfect circuit or anything. So they turn on individually and like kind of scattered. So we want to even utilize that to our advantage by turning on all these other lights that you see here. And these aren't actually lights that were there, but they're little MCs. So there's one MC here, another MC in the back here, and then we have another aperture fixture here. It's just a 1-foot tube. I believe it's the MT Pro. Then we have another MC here and another one. So we have a total of 4 MCs plus that tube, plus lights that we put into these fixtures, as well as there's a little light that she turns on there for her pottery station. So what I had my gaffer do is rig up all these lights and put them on Sidus Link, and then he had the other light on Sidus Link as well. So if we look at Sidus Link, so that's the aperture app, we have 3 switches that we're switching on. So we have the house lights, and then we have the, I would say, accent lights. So that's the stuff all around the perimeter. And then we have that light at the workstation. So I'm just gonna say light workstation. Right, so I had my gaffer throw on the house and then throw on the accents right after that. And then as she walks over to this way to turn on that, she turns on the workstation light. So he had his phone out, just kind of setting them up. And then we had a bunch of time to set this up. So we're doing a bunch of rehearsal takes. This is how we went to this darkly lit scene, to the naturalistic and very homey in terms of very early morning and going to work and getting that and capturing that naturalistic feel. The next shot that we're going to look at is later on in the day, and it's a dolly shot that leads into a bunch of her products and everything that she's looking at. So we're doing a dolly in here, focusing on this cup while there's an action happening in the foreground. So as a cinematographer, I want my viewer to be focused obviously on the cup in terms of being very intentional, but I also want some action and everything happening in the background to say like, hey, this is something that she is passionate about. This is something that she does for a living. And this is the craft and the center focus that we're focusing on. We're shifting our focus from her basically to the craft, and that happens in the edit. And this is how you can do that with your composing as well as like focusing techniques as well. There's no rack focus or anything here, but in the narrative, she's actually starting to talk about her work and what inspires her. And this is a perfect opportunity to start looking at her work. And we can do that with an intentional dolly shot with her working in the background that shows that the hard work that she's putting in and the result with her products right in front. So this was a challenge that the directors kind of put on me in terms of like, hey, we want everything to feel super intentional, but not forced. And this didn't feel even forced because this is a super intentional shot of having the dolly coming in and doing that. So in terms of making this feel naturalistic, like we said before, we had that tube in the background that was lighting up that, but that wasn't enough output at this point. So what I have is a Forza 500 with a Fresnel. So if I were to draw this light, that's my light fixture. And this is set at 5600 Kelvin. So this is daylight balanced. And then on the outside of that, there's a Fresnel. So this lets me focus it or flood it even more and give it more direction. So I have that kind of blasting through these windows, and this is elevating the already naturalistic look of the sun. And we wanted just a consistent sun to be in the background, so we had this light that up there and on all day. And this was only at 20%. We didn't need this any brighter. We don't need a 1200D even. We're trying to replicate the sun. We are just painting what's on the wall. And then I had my gaffer flood this and hit the whole side of the garage door, so it give me these nice shapes of light in terms of using the garage door as basically as one of those things that you put in front of a spotlight mount. And it's just giving us a nice splash of paint on the wall and giving us this beautiful light and dark parts of our image like a checkerboard. We have this light image here, then we have some dark, and then our focus as well as some highlights on our subject. And then we go over here and there's so much interest and contrast happening. And this is acting as my main key light. I didn't want anything super soft because this is not supposed to be naturalistic. We have a garage door and I'm gonna utilize that to motivate all my light. And luckily we did plan this during the location scout in terms of where to put this. But there's a skylight as you saw in the other shot here. And then in the skylight, the sun is kind of hitting it this way, and then it's bouncing all the light around it and acting as a giant softbox. And because it's so far away, it's not super harsh or anything, and it's giving us all this light. And then what we had to do is basically cheat in terms of composing, in terms of developing some shadow. The natural softbox that's happening here from the skylight is over here, and we're biasing our cup on this side, on the edge, so we develop some contrast and shadow in the cup. If I just had it over here, you could see it would flatten it out in terms of the light that's coming in, and we want to basically add a nice edge to this as well as some shadow. So we see that nice contrast here. Then you could see the direction of the shadow in terms of where that light is coming from. So if I were to look at the highlights and everything here, that's nice. It's giving it a lot of shape. And this tells me the shadow that it is being lit like this and being backlit. If I had the cup over for say here, it'd be a super harsh shadow pointing down, or if even over here, you could see what is happening with these cups. So it was just positioning the cup in terms of what felt the most naturalistic, as well as highlighting the cup in terms of its best light, developing contrast and making it feel good as well. The next shot that we're going to be looking at is a closer up of her working at this station and utilizing the Forza 500 and everything we set up before. So like I said, this is basically our light and frame here, and that is a Forza 500 with our Fresnel kind of spread wide open, and this is set at 5600 Kelvin, and then we kept this at this relative 20%. Not much, but this is basically acting as my edge light, and we're ultimately using this as a book light kind of bounce as well. Not necessarily book light, mainly just using it as a bounce. So if I look here, I have a white wall, and I'm utilizing this to my advantage. Usually in a lot of spaces, people get scared of white walls. I do too, because it just absorbs so much light, and it's a lot more to work with in terms of dealing with spilling off light and flagging it off. But I use this as in my advantage because I use this as a bounce. So I had my gaffer bias the light shooting more behind her, giving her an edge light, as well as aiming it at this wall to give me a bounce that seemed most naturalistic as possible. So this edge light is blowing out the highlights in the window, which is no problem. And then it's giving these edge and nice highlights to the back of her, as well as here too. So we're completely backlighting her and using this hard source, and then I'm using that bounce source to fill the rest of her shadows to give it that elevated look. This is not a super contrasty look at all. I could have added a flag, but we didn't really want to do that because we wanted this to feel bright and airy and naturalistic. If I had a flag in here, I feel like it would be too much contrast, and right off the bat with this setup, the directors were super happy, so we didn't really have to change much. And then you can see that bounce coming in here more on her jewelry, as you can see that edge coming there, and then we have that kind of negative fill coming in back here. So because we're dealing with a white wall, we are acting as our key light as the wall, but also it's acting as a fill back into the shadow. So if you wanted to, a solution, if you wanted to make this more contrasty, you could have a neg on that wall and then a neg behind camera. And then we wanted to make this feel a little bit dreamy and a little bit more elevated, so we have some lens flaring going on. And then in the piece, we can see that we utilize that a lot. So this was just a really good feeling moment, and then we wanted to make it look bright and airy as possible. The next shot that we're going to be looking at is breaking the fourth wall in terms of making this feel not necessarily more organic, but more intentional. This story is about her and her resilience in terms of what she's gone through, in terms of her business and everything like that. And then we wanted to make this feel good in terms of like, oh, I know you're watching my story and this is what I have to tell. This was a 4-part series and this was a common theme, and we wanted to have a consistent shot across the piece, and this is exactly what we used. So we still have the major lights in play in terms of what I was talking about in the last scene. So we have that Forza 500 about in this area here with that Fresnel at 5600 Kelvin, and that's behind the garage door, and you can see that light being painted here. And then over top of her, I wanted to motivate this skylight, even though it's not directly above her at all. It's actually directly above this table, but I wanted to have that same top look feeling, and the way that we achieved that is we used a Nanlite Pavo Slim. So it's a 1x2 panel light, and then this is sit at 5600 Kelvin. It's matching that. This was roughly sitting around 10%. So this has a grid on it, as well as it's double diffused with the diffusion that comes in the softbox. And then I felt this was even too harsh, so we had another little flag there, and then this was a silk that we just boomed out as well. So these are boomed out directly overhead, and that silk just even softens the light even more. So we have that coming down and acting as a top light. So it was biased in terms of a little bit forward to her. So if we were to draw her position, she's here, camera's right here, and then we have the light fixture right here. So this is like a top-down view, and then I have that bias forward so we can get the actual shape on her. If I had it back or even right on top of her, you would probably get raccoon eyes. But we were still kind of getting that feeling, as you can see with the shadow that it's developing in her neck, and we needed to basically soften that up. So what we used is a little white card, which was just a white piece of paper, and we put that underneath her, and then I had my grip holding that as she walked in, and we got all the other shots, and this is filling in the rest of her shadows as well as lifting some of the shadows that you see here, and then mainly give us that beauty lighting that we're looking for. And that's what you usually do with beauty lighting in terms of having a key, and then having, if we look at our subject here, and then having a bounce board to fill up all those shadows as well. So this is like a beauty lighting thing. I believe this is like called clamshell lighting, and there's a lot of other references and techniques to them as well. So a little bit from like the product space that I used to be in a lot, and utilizing those techniques in terms of elevating this. Next shot that we're going to be looking at is this cup shot. This was a reference that we used from our frame set video in terms of that feeling of having that light in the middle of it, and then we referenced that video from the Batman in terms of that Joker scene when we're actually looking at the cup. So we kind of wanted this same look and feel, but we wanted to duplicate this over a lot of cups. So basically we had to build our own world, and this is shot on that center table with that skylight. So that was a problem already in terms of how do we make this look different and feel different from that. And this is when she's talking about her work and what inspires her. So to light this, we actually use this little Zhiyun light here, and what I love about this light is that its ability to add a set of diffusion, a grid with the set of magnets, as well as these barn doors. So it's perfect for shots like this in terms of just adding a little bit of light. And if you want to double diffuse it, you can buy another set of these and use the same diffusion. And that's what we did to do this. And I have that light right above here, and this is boomed out with a simple C-stand. And then I have that diffusion, then I have the grid, and I believe we use another layer of diffusion and then use the barn doors to even shape this more. So it builds that natural vignette. And then this is the light shooting down here. But we kind of had to build out like our own little black box to do this. So boomed overhead, we actually have another floppy boomed out and creating this L, and then we have another floppy behind that, and it's just leaned up and it's kind of boxing this in completely. So if I were to redraw this in terms of a little small scale on the side, we have our little cup here, then we have that floppy boomed out there, and then we kind of have another floppy in the background giving us this dark. We didn't really need anything on the left side, and then we have that little light, and then this is very top light, so it's highlighting the edges of the product and then giving us a nice hard shadow in the bottom. And then this is just very pleasing in terms of a center framed and having a little detail in the back in terms of this top light. It's supposed to feel very naturalistic in terms of what you'd see in a home, and usually light fixtures are right directly above you. This is how, you know, you achieve that naturalistic look. So we have some nice highlight in the background, and then these stayed consistent as we kept changing the cup. So to do this, we use an image overlay on our monitors, and then we position the cup each time. But when I was editing this, it was kind of slightly off from me hitting stop and start on the camera and everything like that, and just general people moving. So what I did in Photoshop is I removed one of the cups, and then I regenerated the layer in the background, and then masked out all the cups and just put them on top of each other so we would have a consistent background as the cups were changing. You can see it a little bit, but it was good enough in terms of what we were trying to pull off. Now the next shots that we're going to be going into are the specialty shots of the piece, and this is not necessarily talking about lighting. I'm going to add the lights in terms of what we shot, but elevating your work to make these narrative commercials, these naturalistic pieces in terms of working in a working space or just telling somebody's story. These specialty shots that elevate your work completely. And once we started implicating these into our work, this kind of really changed everything in terms of giving the viewer different perspectives of really getting immersed. So inside the kiln here, we have a Sony FX3, and this is on a 12mm lens. So if I were to just draw the lens there, and then the camera body down here, and then we just use the director's monitor to actually frame this up and make it look perfect. Instead of like rigging up a whole thing, I just had my AC build out the camera and then run a feed in terms of just having a V-mount on the side as well as a tear deck on the side, and there are cables just laying there. And this was completely fine in terms of what we're doing. We don't need to rig up this camera fully. I love using the Sony FX3 for these kind of specialty shots because it's so easy to rig. And even people use it on Hollywood films, and everybody loves the Sony FX3. This is just just utilizing the composing techniques of center frame and then just making this feel super intentional in terms of what we're supposed to be looking at. We could have put this on offside, but we kind of felt that, it has to be center frame. We want to utilize that the shapes and everything that we have for us and everything like that. But we had to add some levels back into her. So we have a little MC kind of biased here, as you can see there. And this is kind of shooting up and giving us levels to even the size of the door as well as everything else. And then we have just a tube light just kind of sitting off to the side, matched to this very warm, so around like 3200 Kelvin. And this is just adding some levels to the face because as she reaches in, it's kind of moving, and then this light is spilling everywhere as well as giving some levels to back to the top. If you wanted to make this like look super commercial, you wouldn't necessarily have a different contrast ratio in terms of like she's like kind of very dark and then the background is very light. You will really want to, reverse this in terms of having your subject a little bit lighter so we can really focus on that. But we want to make this feel as naturalistic as possible, and we're kind of playing against time and just getting the shot in terms of really dialing in our lights and everything like that. The last specialty shot that we're going to be looking at is a very interesting one because this was a very like kind of problem solving thing for me in terms of working with a garage door and the directors wanting to put the camera on the garage door. This was a fantastic idea and I was really up to the challenge, but it was an interesting one because whenever you want to attach a camera to a surface, you usually use suction cups on something like that. But you can see that this is kind of a stamped aluminum surface. So it has like these bumps and divots and everything here. So I was very concerned that the suction cups wouldn't necessarily work. And when you open a garage door, that they have these hinges here. So I only have a panel about 2 feet, as you can see here, to work with. So I kind of racked my brain in terms of what would work. And then I thought about the lighting that I use in terms of putting lights anywhere. And usually when I like to put lights anywhere, especially Titan tubes, I use magnets. So I was thinking, is the garage door magnetic? Is it made out of steel? Is it made out of aluminum? So these were kind of things I had to test. But what I basically built, a right angle plate, and then on that right angle plate is sitting our Sony FX3. And then for this, we used a 20 mil. The 12 mil was a little bit too wide and giving off a little too much. We kind of want to change it up. And then that is set on a quick release plate right here. And then we didn't really have any Teradek. You could put like a V-mount battery and stuff like that onto this, but we just wanted to utilize the camera. And then on this, I put a bunch of magnets here. And the magnets that I actually used are these magnets right here. And what I love about these magnets is it's a 1/4-20 thread. And then you have your magnet here, and it's pretty strong. So it gives a lot of grip, and I use like 2 of these for 1 Titan tube. It's more than enough. And then for this, I think I had like 2 rows of like 6. So I had like 12 magnets. So I just didn't want the camera to go anywhere, but I knew I could hold it as it was going up. So it's just magnets, a right angle plate, which has like a bunch of cheese plate holes that allow for like threading in different accessories and everything like that. Then the FX3 on a quick release plate so I can move it and position it and everything like that. And then because it was just magnets, I could just stick it to the door and then I could kind of rotate it to get the perfect leveling of the camera in terms of tilting, not necessarily panning, but it gave us something that was close enough. And then the way I tested this, I just went to my parents' house and I'm like, I really hope that this door is steel and not aluminum, because steel is magnetic and not aluminum. And then I just built the plate and just stuck it there. I'm like, we should be good because it's a generic garage door and we should be good. It was kind of taking my risk and chances. I did bring the suction cups just in case, but I was pretty sure that this method was going to work well. We didn't have any lights here. This was pretty later in the day and this was one of the last shots. So the natural ambient light coming from outside was giving me enough in terms of interest and naturalistic on her face as well as her shoulders. And then we just turned off all the lights, and this is the skylight just kind of acting as our fill back here into the room to give us some levels to the room. But we didn't really add any lights and everything like that. Usually with specialty shots, you're focused on the movement and everything, especially if you have it physically attached to something. And this sells everything, and then you just have to usually add a little kicker or something to kick out your subject and make you focus on that. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more commercial breakdowns like this, I have a video queued up here that you'll enjoy.